Welcome back to Morning Joe. Joining us now, Chairman of the National Governors Association, Republican Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland. He's author of the new book, Still Standing: Surviving Cancer, Riots, a Global Pandemic, and the Toxic Politics That Divide America. Governor Hogan, congratulations on the book. Great to have you with us. We will dig deeply into the book in just a moment, but just want to ask you for an update right now in your state in the middle of this pandemic. Yesterday, I think you had the lowest number of current hospitalizations since way back at the end of March. What have you done in your state to get your arms around coronavirus?
Well, look, so far we're doing pretty well, and as we're very concerned about some of the spikes and increases all around the country and all around our state, actually, with our surrounding neighbors. But so far, we've been trending in the right direction. We're down on our positivity rate. We're down on the rate of case increase. We're down on hospitalizations, ICU beds, and deaths. So we're happy with where we are, but we're still very, very concerned, and we're staying vigilant, because this is by no means is this crisis behind us, and it can turn on a dime and spike up again, as we've seen across the country. But we took very early and aggressive action in our state, and it's been working so far.
Yeah, I want to ask you about schools. A big question, as you're well aware, I'm sure you're hearing from parents across the state of Maryland. There's a fight right now at the federal level. Donald Trump says schools must reopen in the fall. He's threatened to cut off federal funding. Obviously, these decisions will be up to people like you and local school districts. What did you make of the president's threat to cut off federal funding to schools if you don't reopen under his order?
That was very unfortunate, and I really don't know what prompted such a remark. We had a great discussion on Monday with all the nation's governors and the National Governors Association. We had the Vice President led the call. Dr. Robert Redfield was on there, laying out the CDC's suggested guidelines for states and local governments, and it was a productive discussion. I think, all of us, I think, are anxious to get our kids back to school, but we want to go about it in a safe way. And the guidelines that were put out by the CDC, I thought, were helpful. Our state is also taking a look at listening to the scientists. We're including all of the teachers, the stakeholders, all of our local boards of education with the state board are reviewing and coming up with a plan. And the federal government had given some good suggestions. And then I have no idea what it was that the president was concerned about, or why he didn't like the CDC report. Or what this threat was about, but it really was not helpful to the discussion. I think everybody should be on the same page. We want to keep our kids safe, and we want to try to get people back to school in a safe way.
To be clear, Governor, about how our education system works in this country, will your decisions about reopening schools be impacted at all by the rhetoric of the president, or is it a decision that's made at the state and local level?
It's really made at the state and local level, and so our state superintendent of schools and our state school board, which is independent of the governor's office, we try to take the politics out of it. They work with the local boards of education in all of our counties and in the city of Baltimore, and they take input from the scientists, the doctors, the teachers, the parents. They try to gather all the information, give flexibility to the various jurisdictions to make the decisions that are right for their communities, and that's the way it's going to be done. While we appreciate input from the CDC and from the federal government, we're not going to be bullied or threatened by the president, and I don't think that's helpful for him to make those kinds of comments.
So fair to say a threat to cut off federal funding will not impact your decisions?
I don't think we're going to have federal funding cut off, and it's the last thing we should be talking about right now. As chairman of the National Governors Association, we're pushing, as your last guest was talking about, we desperately need more assistance to state and local governments so that we can not have drastic cuts to education, and so we can continue to pay our teachers and our police officers and firefighters and our healthcare workers and frontline workers. So we're in need of more federal funding, not less federal funding, and that's it's something that all of the governors are united in fighting for.
Governor Elise Jordan's here with a question for you. Elise?
Governor, congratulations on your new book. And I'm curious, you're one of the most popular governors in the country, a Republican who has managed to work with both sides. And what kind of future, post-Trump future, do you see for the Republican Party if Donald Trump is not reelected in November?
It's one of the things that I talk about in the book, actually, about, the book is really kind of a look at my life story. I think I've got some interesting thoughts to share, and hopefully people will find the book an interesting read. But I do, it's not a policy paper, it's not a boring political book. But I do talk a little bit about what I see as a future for the Republican Party and for the country. And I'm very frustrated with the divisive politics today and the dysfunction. And, I've tried my best to kind of avoid the extremes of either party and to find that middle ground where we can all stand together. I think most people in America are somewhat frustrated with the political process. They're looking to go in a different direction. And regardless of what happens in this election in November, I think both parties are going to take a long look at re-examining themselves between now and 2024, because once we get past this pandemic, this global pandemic, and get that behind us, I don't want to see Washington just return to the same toxic politics that we've been dealing with for years.
Governor Mike Barnicle has a question for you. Mike?
Governor, the world has seen people involved in protests over the last 2 months that have never been involved in protests before in their lives, due largely to the first televised public execution of a man, George Floyd. And I'm pretty sure that everyone in the city of Baltimore was stunned by what they saw, but not really surprised. What, in your view, is the future of policing in America?
Well, first of all, obviously the senseless murder of George Floyd has kind of brought all of this to the surface, and it's engaged people all across the country, including here in the state of Maryland and in Baltimore. And one of the things I'm most proud of is here in our state, for the most part, we've had very peaceful protests, and we had thousands of people come out, express their frustrations, let their feelings be known, talk about how do we address some of these underlying issues of systemic racism, and yet we didn't have the violence that many of the other cities saw, and I think that's something I'm really happy with. We did have violence 5 years ago, right after I became governor. I talk about that experience in my book as well, after the death of Freddie Gray. And we had some violence erupt in the city of Baltimore. I made sure that we worked very hard to protect the citizens, to stop the violence and the senseless destruction of property and harming people. But we allowed peaceful protests to go on for a solid week, and I walked the streets and talked with community leaders. And I think right now we've got to find a way to let people to let people get out and protest and express their feelings. We've got to address some of these underlying issues, but we've got to stop kind of out of control mobs that are breaking the law in cities. So you can't have that continue to go on.
Governor Hogan, Al Sharpton, I do remember you trying to bring some closure after the Freddie Gray case when you came in, and I look forward to reading what you say about it in your book. But as we are at this moment with George Floyd, and you have worked with local clergy that I am familiar with, and community leaders and others like Larry Young, we also need to see some legislation. You said systemic racism. What do you, as a Republican governor that has respect on both sides of the political spectrum, what do you say that you think your party ought to be doing legislatively and concretely to address the problems of policing in this country, particularly since you've had the experience of Freddie Gray all the way to now being governor in this era with George Floyd?
Well, these are certainly not easy answers, but many of these things obviously have to be addressed, both at the local, the state, and the federal level, and I think those discussions are taking place. We haven't by any means solved these issues in our state, but we have been working towards them and working on trying to solve them over the past almost 6 years, at least 5.5 years since the Freddie Gray situation in Baltimore. We're working under a consent decree in the Baltimore City Police, and they've made a lot of changes, and that police force is a majority minority. It's got they tried to change their training procedures and how they go about recruitment. And I think at the state level 2 years ago, we passed legislation at the state level that put a lot of these reforms in place in our state already, and I signed it into law after it passed our Democratic legislature. And there's proposals this year. We're working with the presiding officers in our Senate and House to talk about taking another look at that and see what else needs to be addressed. But those are discussions I think that are helpful and that we need to be having, and I think we'll make some progress both at the federal and state level and local level.
Governor Hogan, Caddy mentioned your approval rating hovering somewhere around 80% in the state of Maryland. You're coming out with a book about your life and your political career. Has many people wondering, particularly in the political press, if you're up to something more. Are you considering down the road a run for president, perhaps in 2024? I know you won't make any announcements here this morning, but is that something that is on your radar screen?
Well, look, I've heard that talk, and it's flattering that people would consider that. But really, I've got an important job here in Maryland until January of 2023. I'm term limited after that. But we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're in the middle of an economic crisis and dealing with lots of other issues. This book really wasn't about that. It was about, number one, telling a story about how we overcame the odds and how we have been successful in bringing people together as a Republican governor in the bluest state in America. And it's about talking about the future and what I see as some of the ways that we can move our country in a better direction. But we have a long way. We got to get beyond this election in November, and then we got 4 years after that. So I think it's just too early to be speculating about what might happen in that next presidential election.
All right, we'll ask you again a little bit later. Then, Governor Hogan, the new book is still standing, Surviving Cancer, Riots, a Global Pandemic, and the Toxic Politics That Divide America. Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, thank you very much for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up, former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb warned this past weekend the United States is right back where we started when the coronavirus epidemic was peaking in New York. The difference now is that there are several epicenters across the country. We'll also have him weigh in on school reopening when he joins us next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.